Good day, everybody. So, today we are going to talk about sleep. Get my computer looking good here. Um, Sleep is such a it's such a big topic because for those of us with chronic symptoms and autoimmune, if we are not getting enough sleep, it can be actually the culprit to our symptoms flaring up. And I mean, that puts a lot of pressure around sleep. I know for me, for years, it was like, if I don't get enough sleep, then dot, dot, dot. Like that was the story that was running in my head. Like everything, my whole existence as a mother, as a partner, as an entrepreneur, as a human being, mostly as a mother at this time because I had young kids. I wasn't working at the time. Um, and whether or not we are going to have a flare all depended, for me, right? Whether or not I was going to be bedridden and in pain or functional many times depended on how much sleep I got. Which, if you're trying to go to sleep with that kind of pressure, it adds to the problem of not being able to sleep. So, you know, um, I would love to say you have to just take the pressure off. Like, yes, that is a piece of it, but it is way easier said than done. Um, so, why do we have insomnia? Okay, so the pressure part is one piece of it, but obviously, if we were getting consistent sleep our entire lives and not getting sleep was never an issue, then we wouldn't really have that story or that program running, right? So, how does this start and why does it start? So, first of all, for most people, if we are, I would say in every case, if we aren't sleeping, I mean, there can be, I mean, I guess I have to leave some room for variables, right? Different variables. But usually it's always either chronic current daily stress, like maybe you're in a dysfunctional relationship, or your actual home is not safe, right? So chronic stress. Um, or early childhood stress and trauma. So, what happens with the system is in those early years when, even as a little one, if we had, if we didn't have healthy attachment to a caregiver and we were, let's say, um, not, fed on time, we were not held and picked up, we didn't receive the amount of nurturance and care that a little one requires. So as babies, up until, gosh, maybe 7 years old, we actually need our caregivers to help soothe us. The whole self-soothing thing for an infant is actually impossible. Like they need co-regulation. There's no other way. That's how they're learning to regulate their nervous system is through another caregiver. So they literally rely on the caregiver's system to help to regulate theirs. Theirs is not developed yet. It doesn't have the same um, functionality and intelligence as an adult nervous system would have in terms of how to settle and how to regulate, right? And so if we grew up with any kind of attachment stuff going on, and I don't know many people who don't have some of this, then that's going to run some fight or flight going on in our body at a really young age. And let's say that we were taught to fight, um, uh, sorry, losing my train of thought here. we were encouraged and taught to cry it out. Thank you. My God, I was like trying to figure out the words. Cry it out. Okay. So our parents left us in our crib. We cried and cried and cried for 30 minutes, and then we finally gave up. That's actually encouraging the freeze response. So the baby doesn't settle. Their nervous system doesn't heal just by forcing them to cry until nobody comes. What that actually does is reinforces to the little one, to the baby, that nobody's taking care of me and nobody is going to be here to help to regulate and help help me. I'm all alone essentially. And they eventually, their systems run is going into fight or flight, right, as much as they can with that crying and crying and crying. They can't fight, they're too little to fight, but they're fighting. Then the system goes into a freeze response, which is total collapse and shutdown of the system. So I would say, like, when we are trying to understand sleep, understanding the nervous system basics is really important. We have two branches of the nervous system, a sympathetic and the parasympathetic. In the parasympathetic, we have a couple of different, like, sort of side branches that go off from the parasympathetic. We have a low tone dorsal, which is our rest and digest state, which is a very restful state. It's the state that we need to be in when we're going to sleep. It's the state that we actually should be in for the majority of our lives. Of course, we want some sympathetic activation, healthy sympathetic range to go to work, to be a parent, to do things, to function in society and get things done, right, and be productive. But we want to have this nice even flow of parasympathetic and sympathetic range. Now, the parasympathetic system also has a high tone. So low tone dorsal is rest and digest. High tone dorsal is freeze. And that is conservation mode. That is when the system has no more fight left and it has completely shut down. And that is the state that the baby goes through when we do this cry it out. Always, if someone is representing or presenting is the word. I have a hard time finding my words today. All the time, if someone is presenting to have a lot of freeze in their system, this looks like chronic fatigue, this looks like weakness, dissociation, brain fog, not being able to find their words, not always, but that can be a symptom, not being able to have, sharpness in the mind. These are all symptoms of that freeze state. Now, there is freeze that is more debilitating, and then there's what we call functional freeze. So there's like a non-functional freeze, which was what I was in for the majority of the time that I suffered with symptoms from lupus. And then there's the functional freeze, which we would see behavioral patterns like, let's see, that fawn response, which is people pleasing, which is like a huge one. And people who are just going through their day-to-day life with a bit of numbness, right? So they're still a bit dissociated and detached from the body, and they don't feel a lot, and there's not a whole lot of emotion coming through. There's also a lack of joy and like vigor, right? There's like they've lost a large part of their life force energy, right? That like energy that keeps us going, that keeps us vibrant and healthy and strong and joyful. And a lot of people who are in functional freeze or non-functional freeze can't actually access their joy. They also have a hard time accessing compassion, which I think is really interesting. and sympathy for other people. Not always, but that was a symptom that I had. Actually, when I started healing my nervous system, I realized how much compassion I had for other humans that came back online. Like when freeze started lifting from my system, I was like, I was starting to feel things. Now, I mean, this isn't a bad thing, but I was feeling in a lot of emotion for others and animals and things. I had been cut off. Of course, that sometimes makes it harder to go through the world because there's a lot of things that we can feel sad about in this world. But we don't want to be cut off from emotion, right? But human connection and even connection to animals is like the reason why we're here, you know? Not only that, but that is another part of that parasympathetic, the vagus nerve. You guys may have heard that ventral vagal is all part of social engagement and connection. And so we want that to be nice and healthy and strong. When we're shut down, it's not, right? It's not online. So that was just a little bit of history, a little bit of theory, I guess, and background for this sleep topic. So some people, okay, so let me just start by saying, if you have that freeze stuff going on, any of the symptoms that I mentioned, and or you're finding yourself exhausted all day, every day, and then you're like wired at night, or you have chronic fatigue and you also have anxiety. This is such a like juxtaposition. It's very strange. I always thought it was so strange. I was always like, how do I have both of these things? Like I'm exhausted, but I'm anxious. That's because always underneath that freeze is fight or flight. So you have a lot of sympathetic activation underneath that freeze. So there's sort of layers and layers and layers of this dysregulation going on in the body. When that fight or flight is running in the system, that is when we run into this insomnia pattern, okay? Not only that, I think most of us, I have never heard this before. This is just me putting things together and my personal opinion, what I've seen and what I felt in my own body. If we had that cry it out done to us, which most of the people in my generation have, I think only until recently did people stop doing that as parents, then the feeling of loneliness and anxiousness and anxiety, particularly in bed, is heightened. Because we had a trauma, the body perceived it as a trauma as a little one when we were crying and we needed somebody and nobody picked us up. And so from that moment forward, potentially every single time you got in bed, you got anxious. So this is also what forms that pattern of like anxious attachment. If you know anything about attachment theory, right? Now, if our caregivers are consistently not showing up for us all the time, even throughout the day, then we would run that avoidant. Maybe avoidant people sleep a little better. I have not seen a study on that, so I can't say. But in my opinion, and what I've noticed, is people who have insomnia also have a little bit of this anxious attachment, which is sympathetic activation, and it is in combination with this pattern of anxiousness, particularly in that bed area, right? As we're trying to go to sleep. Some people sleep really, 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 really well, really deep, and they think that there's no issue, right? However, if a person has a lot of fight or flight, in their body. Let's say they're running a hypervigilance pattern during the day, or they're really activated. Maybe they have like some anger stuff and some sort of intense behaviors, and uh, some perfectionist stuff, and some of this stuff that we associate with more of that fight or flight uh, patterns. And they crash hard at night to the point where like you couldn't hardly wake them up, or like something going on in the house maybe wouldn't even wake them up, like even in terms of like a potentially harmful situation. That is that the gas on, the brake on, that brake is still really heavy. That's part of the freeze response. And that person is going actually into a sleep that's not even a restorative sleep. So that's actually not healthy. While I feel, part of me feels like because those people are sleeping, they might feel a little better the next day than the person who's not sleeping. But there's a range of ways that this all can manifest in your body. And it all depends on what you grew up with, what your current situation is. And I mean, certainly any kind of acute trauma can play a role. And how your patterns are sort of forming and how your dysregulation presents itself. Everybody is a little bit different. Not any two people are the same, although they can be pretty similar. It's not always exactly the same. So I guess I say this to say even the person who seemingly doesn't have insomnia, or who doesn't have insomnia necessarily, seemingly no sleep issues, might actually be having more sleep issues than they present. Because if they aren't restoring, their body is not actually really restoring itself during the night, during sleep, then they aren't getting the full benefit range of sleep than as they should be. And they are also still in that dysregulation, that fight or flight, freeze, right, and not in that healthy flow. So I wanted to give a little background on what causes anxiety and insomnia. And I also wanted to make sure I validate those of you who have insomnia about like just how hard it is, because I suffered with insomnia for a long time. I still have episodes where I will go into something for a little while. It's usually around a full moon, not every month. I'll go months and months and months, sleep great. Then I'll run into something. I will say menstrual cycle, moon cycles, full moon and new moon can be really tricky for certain people. And then also there's the cycles of your own personal calendar. So we are all always going through a death and rebirth cycle. And so I talk about death and rebirth cycles a lot on this channel because it's really important to understand and to know like when your body is going through a purge of some sort, or a shift or a change, or you are being presented with an opportunity in your horoscope or in your calendar year, or your monthly weekly cycle. It's important to know, and can be helpful to know, when you are going through a big shift, when you are shedding something, and when you are in a phase of sort of bringing something in new, right? Manifestations, like a manifestation type stage. Because these are not only opportunities for growth, but they are times when things can feel really challenging in our body. It's times when things come up that are like really hard, or relationships end, or or you're just feeling something, you don't know why. So this is another reason that if somebody has insomnia that's similar to mine, where it's not all the time, it's like I'll say episodes or phases maybe twice a year now. It differs how long they last, maybe a couple weeks at the most. So if you're like me, mine come up usually around the same time each year. And it's usually when I'm going through like a big death cycle. It's usually when I'm going through something um, really transformational. And I know my cycles of my year and I understand like when those times are. Or if it's a couple of days, sometimes it'll be a couple of days. It's usually around full moon and my cycle, which happen at the same time, right? My menstrual cycle. So that can happen too. So it's always when I'm trying to purge something. My anxiety gets heightened, but it can be really relieving to understand that like your body's actually it's feeling more intensely and having these sort of episodes of anxiety for a reason as well. You know, yes, I always am like, I need to keep doing my nervous system work, right? Because I want to find more regulation so that when these things come up, my body is better equipped to handle them and I can go through the ebbs and flows of my cycles with more ease. That's the ultimate goal. However, I also know that when they come up, it's my body going through something and it's time for me to really alchemize that time and that energy. So I really use it to my advantage if I can. It's not always possible because if we have a job and we have young kids and we have blah, 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 we might need to resort to something to sleep if it's like really bad or whatever. But if we can carve out and create some space to actually work with what is coming up, that actually is sort of the ultimate goal for us and what we would want to do. Um, I feel like this is a lot of information, so I'm going to leave this here, but I am going to do another sleep video. Stay tuned for that um, on what we actually do to help with insomnia and some tips and tricks that I have used and still use when these things come up for me as well. Okay, I hope this finds you very well and see you soon. Bye.